Dear Lord, we praise you for today. We thank you for allowing us to gather here together as a body of believers. And as we go into your word, God, I pray that you will give us eyes to see, ears to hear, minds to understand, and hearts prepared to rightly divide the word of truth and apply it in our lives. Help us understand this text as it was originally meant to be understood, God. Help us not read too much into things. Help us just analyze it and study it, not according to typical Sunday school understandings of the passages or anything like that, God, but rather may we actually try to figure out what's going on here, because there's some weird stuff in this chapter, God. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of strange. But it's there for a reason, and it happened for a reason. So help us understand those reasons, and then figure out how those things and the things that we study there affect us here now. We love you, God, and we praise you. It's in your name that we pray. Amen. All right, we are in 2 Kings, capítulo 2, chapter 2. Anybody want to just real quick, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on context today, mainly because we've got a lot to cover. Briefly, just so you know, broad context, we're in the time period of the divided kingdom, right? So we are no longer in the glory days of King David or King Solomon. Those are long behind us. We are now in the divided kingdom. There's the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And these chapters that we're dealing with are primarily dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel. And things have been going very, very badly because the people of Israel are very, very ungodly. Does somebody want to remind us a little bit of what happened last week in 2 Kings chapter 1?
So, even before chapter 1, I think it's important to remember that Ahab had died very recently, and his death was seemingly accidental, but was in truth an act of God through the way in which he died, and I think the language makes that seem like the case. So Ahaziah, his son, takes over, and he just continues the tradition of idolatry and Baal worship that Ahab and Jezebel had established in the kingdom. And, even during those 2 years, he did enough to make it so that Yahweh saw him as evil. And near the end of his reign, he just falls through this lattice paneling in his upper chambers. We don't know how he gets sick necessarily, whether it was from the injury or from an infection he got from the injury, but he falls ill, and he sends messengers down to Ekron, which is in modern-day Gaza, essentially, to inquire of the god Beelzebub, instead of inquiring of Yahweh, who is supposed to be the God of Israel. And Yahweh is angry at this. He doesn't take too kindly to the provocation, so he sends a messenger down to Elijah to go up and meet the messengers on their road and tell them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you inquire of Beelzebub, god of Ekron? And he essentially says to Elijah to tell the messengers that the king will indeed die. He will not come down from the bed which he has been laid to. And so the messengers return to Ahaziah with the message. He is caught off guard by how suddenly they return. And when they tell him the message and they describe who sent it, he realizes that it's coming from Elijah. So he sends 2 separate commanders who command 50 men each up to a mountain that's outside of Samaria to try and bring Elijah down to meet him. And because they tell him to come down quickly, because they try to tell him to come down forcefully, he instead brings fire down upon them. And then the third commander learns from the mistakes of the others and begs for his life, pleads for his life, puts his life in Elijah's hands, and realizes that the only mercy he could get is through Elijah. And so Elijah agrees to come down and delivers his message personally to Ahaziah, and then Ahaziah dies. And that is pretty much where we left off.
Yeah. So basically, in many ways, last week's chapter was Elijah's last hurrah, right? It was basically this final moment where you get to see that things continue to be tense between Elijah and the kings of Israel, right? Basically, we've been following Elijah for a while. Obviously, we took a break and we were in 1 Peter for a while. But in 1 Kings and in 2 Kings, we spent a lot of time following Elijah. And Elijah, in many ways, goes down in Jewish history as the leader of all the prophets, right? Like whenever you think of the prophet of prophets, you think of Elijah, right? A lot of times we think more so of like, the people who wrote books. Elijah himself did not write a book, right? We usually think of like Isaiah and Jeremiah and stuff. But really, in Jewish history, Elijah is the pinnacle of the prophets. And that's because he really is the one who, he really stuck it to the man and like would wag his finger in kings' faces and tell them how it is. And God did some miraculous, amazing stuff through Elijah. And really last week's chapter, 2 Kings chapter 1, is where we get to see that just even crazier things are happening, right? Literally, Elijah keeps calling down fire from heaven. And this is not the first time Elijah has done something like this. And today's chapter, 2 Kings chapter 2, is unfortunately the chapter where we're going to say goodbye to Elijah. And the mantle of prophetic leadership is going to be passed, right? Like a passing of the baton. It's going to be given from Elijah to his disciple named Elisha. In English, this can be very confusing. In Hebrew, it's not nearly as confusing because in Hebrew, the name Elijah is Eliyahu and Elisha is Elisha. So in Hebrew, it's Eliyahu and Elisha. It's very easy to distinguish who is who. For us, we have to enunciate. It's Elijah and Elisha. Sometimes just to make it easier, I say Elijah and Elisha, just to make it easier to differentiate. But that can be kind of confusing in English. But today we're going to see the passing of the torch moment. And so before we actually jumped into the text, I did want to read something from the commentary that it's Peter Lightheart's commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings. I really like his commentaries. And I've been trying to read from them every now and then whenever he just says things in a very concise way that it would take me like 40 minutes to elaborate on. And he addresses some stuff that we might bring up over the course of our discussion. But I just thought it'd be cool to highlight at the very beginning here. Because the main thing I want to do as we go through the text is really just focus on the text itself and what exactly is happening, why things are happening like that. But there is also this, like what we're going to read about in these chapters, there are these broader implications on the story of Scripture as a whole, both looking backwards and looking forwards. Because what's going to happen here in the character of Elijah and Elisha is going to be repeated again in other characters later on in Scripture. And what they're doing here also calls back to previous characters in Scripture too, to where if you understand the full story of Scripture, you'll probably have a better understanding of what exactly is going on here. And so I thought it'd be kind of helpful for us to just kind of talk about this really early on, and then whenever we go into the text, we can primarily, hopefully understanding this will help us understand what's going on in the text. So this is what we read in Lightheart's commentary. First off, he starts off by saying this, something that we addressed last week. Elijah is a type of John the Baptist, right? So he has a lot of similarities with John the Baptist that we read about in the New Testament. And the transition from Elijah to Elisha foreshadows the succession from John to Jesus, which we read about in the New Testament. Like John, Elijah is a lone voice in the wilderness, but Elisha, like Jesus, is surrounded by disciples. Jesus' ministry is a ministry of life-giving miracles, cleansing lepers, raising dead sons and restoring them to their mothers, relieving distress. Similarly, Elisha raised the dead, provides a meal for 100 men from 20 loaves of barley bread, cleanses a leper. On the surface of things, Elisha is a type of Jesus. Right? So last week we talked about the Elijah and John the Baptist parallels. And then from this point going forward, as we deal with Elisha, I want you to notice the parallels between Elisha and Jesus. But it doesn't stop there. But the typology works another way as well. Elijah himself is a type of Jesus, and Elisha of the disciples who continued Jesus' ministry after the ascension. Elisha first appears plowing a field, but he leaves home and family like the disciples of Jesus who leave their fishing boats and tax booths to follow Jesus. Right? And you'll remember this. That was back in 1 Kings chapter 19. Whenever Elijah first called Elisha, he was plowing the field and he got up and left. Right? It's very similar to the disciples. At the beginning of 2 Kings chapter 2, Elisha doggedly follows his master, refusing to stay behind, until Elijah is taken up from him in a whirlwind. Because he follows Elijah, Elisha becomes like his master. And after Elijah departs, he immediately begins to replicate his ministry. Having received the promised double portion of Elijah's spirit, Elisha is the reincarnation or the reanimation of Elijah, as the church is the body of Christ in the spirit of Jesus. The sons of the prophets recognize the family resemblance between Elisha and his predecessor, just as the Jews perceive the courage of Peter and the apostles and remember that they have been with Jesus, like we see in Acts chapter 4. Right? And so, what we're going to see here in this chapter is that Elisha is going to follow Elijah to the place where Elijah is going to ascend to heaven. And after Elijah ascends to heaven, Elisha is going to receive the spirit, that's the language of the text, he's going to receive the spirit of Elijah, which empowers him to go about a greater ministry than Elijah himself. Well, that's very similar to the apostles, right? So Jesus ascends to heaven and gives us his spirit to go about his ministry, right? But then, not only does it look forward to the New Testament, but it also looks backwards to stuff in the Old Testament. The story of 2 Kings chapter 2 reaches backwards as well. Throughout his ministry, Elijah is a new Moses, and Elisha is his Joshua. Ahab is Pharaoh, and once his son dies, right? So just remember, Ahab's son just died, and that calls back to the Passover event in the book of Exodus. Elijah and Elisha leave the land whose gods are defeated and whose prince is dead, right? Very similar to the Israelites leaving Egypt during the Exodus. Elijah departs on the far side of the Jordan, just as Moses did. If you remember, Moses did not die in the Promised Land. He died on the other side of the Jordan. While Elisha returns to carry on a metaphorical conquest, significantly starting at Jericho, which is a significant site during the conquest under Joshua. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. The Christological typology is thus multi-layered. Moses is Elijah, is John. Joshua is Elisha, is Jesus. Yet also, Moses is Elijah, is Jesus, and Joshua is Elisha, is the church. So it's kind of confusing, but the main thing that we're trying to highlight here is that there's these parallels that we're going to see here. And I would actually suggest that the Moses and Joshua parallel is the chief thing that the author of 2 Kings has in mind, which would make sense because the New Testament hasn't been written yet, right? And so whenever you read the stories of John the Baptist and Jesus in the church, I would argue that the authors of the New Testament have this stuff in mind as well. And we kind of saw that last week, right? Remember whenever we were talking about James and John and they were talking about calling down fire from heaven? It was very clear that the author of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke, he's referencing that because it's calling back to 2 Kings chapter 1, right? But the author of 2 Kings, it seems like he is very clearly referencing back to the Torah with Moses and Joshua. And so as we go through this, I really want to focus on the Moses and Joshua parallels. Sound good? Mm-hmm. All right. That being said, let's get into the text itself. We got a lot of weird stuff going on in this chapter. The very end of this chapter, the beginning of this chapter is already weird. The end of this chapter is probably one of the single most controversial passages in the entire Bible. And I say that because, doing stuff on YouTube, I cannot tell you how many comments I've gotten from internet atheists or skeptics who are like, oh, if God is so good, then explain 2 Kings chapter 2. So buckle up for this because we've got some interesting stuff ahead of us. But we're going to take it one verse at a time. And hopefully the goal is to actually understand it well. So what you'll see here on the right is that I did include a map of Israel for these first few slides, mainly because I thought it would be very helpful for us to just kind of understand exactly what's going on here. So this is what we read. Now it happened, when Yahweh was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And Elisha said to Elisha, stay here, please, for Yahweh has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as Yahweh lives, and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. So they went down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that Yahweh will take away your master from over you today? And he said, yes, I know, be silent. All right. So, right off the bat, what are your thoughts?
It seems like Elisha knows what's about to happen.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing about this. It's not just Elisha who knows. Who else knows?
Elisha.
The prophets.
Well, the sons of the prophets.
Oh, okay.
Right? It seems like everybody knows that this event is about to happen. But what's so interesting about that? Like, as a reader of the book, like, as a reader, why is that interesting?
I don't know if there's a precedent for that beforehand.
Well, there really isn't. That's the interesting thing, right? The interesting thing is that this is all new information to us. And typically, you would expect for the author to explain why everybody knew this. But the author doesn't explain, right? To where literally, I was looking up, like, this is something I was looking up earlier today, like, just because it was kind of stumping me. I was like, why was this necessary? Because for us, it's very easy for us to, if you've heard the story before, you'll be like, oh yeah, Elijah, he goes up to heaven in a chariot of fire. But you gotta ask the question, why? Like, that's, it's not like Elijah is the first godly person to show up on the face of the planet, right? I mean, yeah, he's different than a lot of people, but like, this is strange, right? Like, what we're going to read about in a second is a very strange event. And if we're not careful, we can get so used to, like, hearing the story that we forget to ask the most basic question, what the heck is happening? Because it seems like all the prophets are aware that something's going to happen here. And then Elisha himself admits that he knows about this as well. And so whenever we get there, we're going to have to try to wrestle through that. Why the heck? Why do they know this? Why does this have to happen? What exactly is going on here? We got to wrestle with that question. What else sticks out to y'all here?
I like that Elisha is willing to go with Elijah, and that he's willing to stay with him.
Yeah.
I think I read a little bit ahead. We're going to see more of that later.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right, cool. So real quick, before we break it down verse by verse, somebody want to just summarize those 3 verses. What happens? Put it in your own words.
Basically, it's introduced to us that Elijah is going to be taken up to heaven, and then they're on their way from Gilgal, and Elijah tells Elijah, "Stay here. The Lord's going to send me to Bethel." So he wants him to stay in Gilgal or wherever it is on their road.
Mm.
And then Elisha goes, "No, I will follow you wherever you go as long as you live."
Yeah, and then immediately after that, basically some dudes come up to Elisha and they're like, "So, you know that your master's about to be taken from you?" And he's like, "Yeah, I know. Just shut up." So, okay. It's a very kind of strange moment here. All right, I just want to look something up real quick. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I was wanting to look up one thing in regards to the locations mentioned here, but we'll just work through it ourselves. Okay, now it happened, when Yahweh was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven, that Elisha went with Elisha from Gilgal. So we kind of already addressed this, but this is the first time we've heard of this event, right? But the author speaks of it as if it is a well-known event, which kind of makes sense. Right, because the author of 2 Kings is probably writing to an audience who has heard this story before. Right? I mean, yes, this is the first time it's being written down, but if a famous prophet ascends to heaven in a chariot of fire, as we're going to see, that's probably a story that people are going to talk about for a while. Right? And so it seems like this is one of those places where, for us being 2,000 years removed from the story, we're reading it with different understanding than the original audience. Right? Because for him, he's not saying, "Hey guys, and then it was revealed that he would be taken up." No, he's just like saying, like, yeah, y'all know this story. Right? Now, it happened when Yahweh was about to take up Elijah to the world into heaven. Right? He's not dropping new information on his audience like he is to us. For us, we're like, hold up, what? Like, he's about to do what? To who? No, for his audience, he's like, the author's just like, y'all know this story. that's the part we're coming up on right now, right? Elijah's ministry's coming to an end. God's about to take him up in a whirlwind to heaven. We're going to be talking about this for a while, and so for right now, we'll just kind of let the question of why linger. That's just setting up the context. Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. All right. I want to talk about the locations here. Because this is where it's going to get a little bit confusing here. Mainly because what we're going to see is where are they going to go? They're going to go from Gilgal to where? Bethel. On the map, it's called Bet-El. It's the same thing, right? Bethel. And so there is some dispute as to whether or not the Gilgal mentioned here is the same Gilgal that you see on the map here. Because they're going to go, just so you know, their places they're going here. They're going to go from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho. And it seems like they're going on the same journey this whole time. And so if they go from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho, that's a very weird order of events. You would think that it would go from Bethel to Jericho to Gilgal.
Well, where would the other Bethel be located?
So people, they debate about this because ultimately the name Gilgal just means like stones or like circle of stones. And this in general seems to be like a pretty common name of like locations that like there's several places that could have been referred to as Gilgal at this time period. There is one, I believe, that is like kind of in the region of Judah down here, which would make a little more sense. In which case it's like Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho. But ultimately, we just don't know. Sometimes people some people speculate that it's in a totally different place. However, that being said, I think there might actually be reason to think that the Gilgal here is this one. And this goes back to the whole Moses-Joshua like typology stuff that's going on. Because Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho are not just three random cities. Do you know what story in the Bible is most closely associated with these cities?
Well, there's walls of Jericho came crumbling down. Heard that one a million times in Sunday school.
Was Gilgal close to the place where Jesus got baptized?
It's very close. Yes, that's part of it as well. But I'm talking about specifically in the Old Testament, so stuff that was written prior to 2 Kings.
Israel, they marched around with the walls of Jericho with the trumpets for 7 days. On the seventh day, the walls come tumbling down.
Yeah.
So that one's Jericho. I don't know the other ones.
Yeah. So real quick, let's just flip to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter. Let me see. Where do I want to start at? Let's go look at Joshua chapter 3. So context behind the book of Joshua. Actually, while I'm describing this, I need to look up another thing. Joshua chapter 3. So
Moses crossing the Jordan.
Yes. So if you remember, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are called the books of Moses, right? Or the Torah. And Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. And when Moses dies, who does he put in charge? Joshua. Right? Moses, he is ultimately going to die. He's going to die on the eastern side of the Jordan, on a mount called Nebo, which is over in this area right here. Right? And then, when you get to Joshua chapter 3, you'll notice that in most Bibles, what is the heading for Joshua chapter 3? It's Israel crossing the Jordan. Right? So, this is the Jordan River right here. And Joshua chapter 3 is the moment when the Israelites, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they finally enter the Promised Land. Right? They're going to cross the Jordan River. Hey, Maverick. Hey. So they're going to cross the Jordan River right here. And what's going to happen, and this is going to be significant to our story as well. The Israelites are going to cross the Jordan River, and whenever they do it, the Ark of the Covenant is going to go before them first. And the moment that the people with the Ark of the Covenant step into the water of the Jordan River is going to stop. And it's going to part just like the Red Sea. And the people of Israel are going to cross through the Jordan River on dry ground, and they're going to go into the Promised Land for the first time after wandering for 40 years. And then you go, Joshua chapter 4, and let's jump down to verse 19. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. So you've got Gilgal, and then you've got Jericho, right? If you go flip a few chapters later, Joshua chapter 6, you'll notice that the Israelites decide to go fight a battle. And since they're camped at Gilgal, which is on the eastern edge of Jericho, where do you think is going to be the first place that they battle? Jericho, right? That's why the Battle of Jericho is so famous, right? Because that's the first place that they conquered, right? They cross the Jordan River, they camp at Gilgal, they go to Jericho, and Jericho is demolished, right? And in fact, a curse is placed on Jericho that they say it shall never be rebuilt, right? Or that it's basically going to constantly be destroyed. There's going to be constant warfare. All right, so Joshua 3, they enter Israel. Joshua chapter 4, they camp at Gilgal. Joshua chapter 6, they destroy Jericho. And if you keep reading, you're going to see that in Joshua chapter 7, they go to a place called Ai. And Ai, as we read in the book of Genesis, is directly across from a place called Bethel. Right? Joshua chapter 7, verse 2. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, go up and spy out the land. So the men went up and spied out Ai. All right, main thing I want to highlight there. Whenever the Israelites entered into the Promised Land, three of the most prominent cities that we hear at the very beginning are Gilgal, Jericho, Ai, and Bethel, right? So the significance of Gilgal is that this is the place where the Israelites, that's the first place they camped. That's where they renewed their covenant to God. That's where all the men were circumcised. That's where they devoted themselves to God, right? And then they went in and they conquered Jericho, right? So that represented the first victory that God himself gave them over the Canaanites. And then they went over and they destroyed Ai, which is right next to Bethel. And Bethel has this long history of kind of going back and forth in regards to faithfulness to God. At the time period of the Northern Kingdom, what's the significance of Bethel? Do y'all remember? So Samaria is the capital of Israel, but what was the significance of Bethel?
Was it like spiritual capital?
Yeah, it's more the religious capital, right? If you remember, whenever Jeroboam first took the people up north and kind of just separated them, he built two temples, or two golden calves, and he put one in the north in a city called Dan, and one in the south in Bethel. We don't really hear about Dan as much, and that's probably because it's way up in the north, not as many people go to it, but Bethel is in many ways like the religious center for paganism at the time period of the Northern Kingdom, right? And so I think that we have good reason to think that the Gilgal mentioned here is actually probably the same Gilgal, because it seems like what's happening is that as Elijah is leaving, it's almost like his departure itself, and this could actually explain a little bit of why he has to ascend to heaven. It's almost like his departure is a judgment on the people of Israel, right? It's almost like he is reversing the conquest, right? Because Israel is no longer devoted to God, right? God brought them into the Promised Land to serve him. And throughout the Torah, he told them, if you don't serve me, you will be exiled. And ultimately, we know that that's where the Northern Kingdom is going to head, right? Eventually, the Assyrians are going to come in and take them into exile. And so in many ways, it's almost like Elijah's departure is anticipating that, right? He is metaphorically going out of Israel, and he's visiting all the first places that they went to, and then he's going to cross back into the wilderness, and he's going to leave. But then this is where it gets cool, because he's going to leave Elisha behind, and Elisha is going to go back in and almost begin a new conquest. So Elijah, he was almost like Moses, right? He was the lone prophet in the wilderness, being faithful to the Lord, even whenever everybody was rebelling, right? But whenever Moses leaves, he leaves behind a Joshua figure who is going to go in and conquer the land for God, right? And ultimately, the Northern Kingdom is still going to fall. But we're going to see that Elisha is not alone, right? Even as we see in these first few verses, there's other prophets around. And they're not false prophets. They're actual prophets. Because as we see, they are aware of things that you cannot know simply by reading a book, right? They have had information given to them by God concerning things of the future, right? That's a sign of a prophet. And so these are genuine prophets. And so in many ways, Elijah is the Moses figure who guided the people through the wilderness. And now he goes into the wilderness to leave. And he leaves behind a Joshua figure to go into the land. Quite fittingly, do you know what the name Joshua means? Yehoshua. It's the same as Jesus. Yeshua.
I should know this because that's my brother's name.
Yeah. It means Yahweh is salvation. Do you know what the name Elisha means? Elisha. It means God is salvation. Right? So their names are their names come from the same thing. Right? It's literally Yahweh is salvation and God is salvation. And so their names aren't that different. And so I think it's kind of cool. That there are those parallels there. And that could explain why they go on this specific itinerary. Right? Why they're going Gilgal, Bethel. It doesn't really explain the order of those events, of those places. But at the very least, it might explain why those cities in particular. Does that make sense? Okay. So it happened when Yahweh was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Right? So Elijah is traveling with him. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for Yahweh has sent me as far as Bethel." All right? So, what does Elisha say?
No, as long as you live, I will follow you.
What does Elijah say? Stay.
Oh.
Right. Yes. Sorry, it can be confusing.
I know.
What does Eliyahu say? He says, "Stay here." Right? You stay here in Gilgal. I'm going to go off on my own. Why does he say this?
Because he knows what's about to happen. He's about to go into heaven.
Yeah, but honestly, it's kind of hard to tell, right? It's hard to figure out why exactly Elijah says it. I mean, it'd be helpful if the author just told us, right? He said this because he was trying to test Elisha's faithfulness. Ultimately, in the end, that's what's going to happen, right? Ultimately, what we're going to see is that Elisha is the type of person who says, "Hey, you're my master. I'm following you wherever you go." Right? And so we're going to be left with we're going to be left with a very good image of who Elisha is. We're going to say, "Wow, this is an amazing guy. Even though he had every opportunity to leave, he doesn't." Right? That's really cool. But we don't ultimately know why Elijah told him to stay. Right? Was he testing him? Was he wanting to see whether he was fickle and whether he just would just abandon him at any moment? Or was it his humility? Right? He realizes it seems like all the prophets are aware of what's about to happen, and maybe Elijah is just he's not wanting a spectacle, right? He's like, "Hey, I'm about to go be with God, but I don't want this to be about me. You know what? Let's just make it a private moment. Nobody has to see it." Right? It could be something like that. We really don't know why Elijah says it. We simply know that he says it, right? And the author feels the need to record it because ultimately it comes out looking really good for Elisha, because this dude's just going to be persistent. And he's basically doing the same thing that Ruth said to Naomi, right? "Where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay." Right? This is what a disciple should do, right? He says, "When I started following you, I said I would follow you to the end. And therefore, that's what I'm going to do." So he says, "Stay here, please, for Yahweh has sent me as far as Bethel." But notice he does not say, "Yahweh has told you to stay here." Right? If he had said that, then presumably Elisha would have stayed. But instead, he just says, "Hey, I'm asking you to stay. God is sending me over that way." To which Elisha says, "As Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you." This is actually a really cool statement spoken in regards to Elijah, and it's almost kind of funny. Do you see why it's funny?
Because he eventually receives Elijah's spirit.
Oh yeah, there's that as well. I didn't even think about that. But do you know? So what is he promising on? As Yahweh lives and as your soul lives. So how long does Yahweh live? Forever. As your soul lives, typically for humans, that's a pretty temporal thing. But the way that this story is going to end, well, Elijah's not going to die. And so this is like a doubly eternal, like promise. Because ultimately, we know that Yahweh lives forever, and Elijah is one of 2 figures in the Bible who we read about who does not die. Which is crazy, right? But, so it's just kind of funny right here because it seems like Elisha knows that. Because typically you don't hear people say the second part. Usually they just say, as Yahweh lives. But Elisha throws in, and as your soul lives too. It's almost like he's hinting at the fact that he knows what's about to happen. Right? As Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. In other words, I'm not going anywhere and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Right? Because as long as you got breath in your lungs and as long as our living God continues to live, well, then I'm sticking with you. Elijah seemingly doesn't argue this. And so they went down to Bethel. This is one of those places where if you look at it, it's always confusing whenever the Bible says they went down somewhere. But what you got to recognize is that typically it's speaking either topographically or spiritually. So whenever we say going down to a place, we're typically thinking like geographically, like you go down when you go south. Biblically speaking, that's not how they think. Usually going up or down is either topographical in the sense of you're going up a mountain or down to a valley, right? And so whenever it says, they went up to Mount Ararat, or that was actually kind of ironic because the word Ararat literally means to descend. Because it's literally the mountain of descent, because that's where the Noah's boat landed. That was just a word, like nerd thing. Okay, whenever they descend, they go down, right? So that's typically how the Bible speaks. But it also sometimes speaks spiritually, right? And so you will never hear the Bible ever say that you went down to Jerusalem. Because, biblically speaking, you cannot go down when you go to Jerusalem. Even though Jerusalem itself is not a very big hill. And a lot of places that you go to might be sitting at a higher elevation than Jerusalem itself. But Jerusalem is the meeting place of heaven and earth, right? That is where God chose for his name to dwell. And so, biblically speaking, you always go up to Jerusalem. That can explain why they're going down to Bethel. Because Bethel, even if it is further north or something like that, it is the center of paganism at this time period, right? And so they're going down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha. Right off the bat, what's so shocking about that?
They were going down to Bethel. That's weird because I'm trying to think of the way to say it.
In verse 3. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel.
Whoops.
What's so weird about that phrase?
There's prophets at Bethel.
Yeah. And as we're going to see, they seem to be genuine prophets. These aren't false prophets. These are genuine prophets. This actually should be super encouraging to us. Because, this is the first time we've heard about these guys. Right? If you go back to the end of 1 Kings, most of the actual prophets were put to death. If you recall that. And there were a very small amount left. But what we get to see is that Elijah is leaving the world better off than, like the world that Elijah leaves behind is actually better off than the world that he came into. That's what we want to do in our lives, right? We want to, we don't need to make a huge impact on the world, but as long as we can try to make it a little bit better than it was when we entered into it, then that's a good sign, mm-hmm. Right? And Elijah, in many ways, he probably had a very frustrating ministry. But at some point that isn't mentioned in the text, apparently there was this a prophetic group that was established that is being faithful to Yahweh. And not only are they being faithful to Yahweh, they're doing it in the heart of paganism, right? So in the midst of all this idolatry and sin, there is still a remnant who is faithful. And not only are they faithful, but apparently they're hearing the word of God, which is super cool, right? We don't read about these guys performing all sorts of miracles like Elijah, but ultimately they don't need to. The more significant thing is that they're hearing from God. And I think that's just really encouraging. Ultimately, what does it mean to be a son of the prophets like that? There's just a group of probably young men who Elijah had trained up to be prophets. Probably very similar to how we have seminaries and stuff nowadays. But obviously in seminary, I'm not trained to be a prophet. I'm trained to teach. But Elijah apparently could do this, right? He taught people how to hear from God and stuff, which is kind of cool. So the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel they came out to Elisha. And this is where we get to see that they are genuine prophets because they are aware of something that's going to happen in the future. And they said to him, "Do you know that Yahweh will take away your master from over you today?" Why do you think they ask him this?
I feel like they're basically telling him your master is going somewhere you cannot follow.
Yeah.
I think he wants them to think about what's about to happen. Like they may not know that Elijah is about to go to heaven.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they obviously do know it, but they're asking whether or not he does. But I think the implication seems to be that they expect that he does. I mean, if they, just these unnamed sons of the prophets, know this, it's safe to assume that, like, you know, Elijah's right-hand man, who's been, like, his closest disciple, is probably aware of this information as well. And so to me, it seems like maybe they could just genuinely be curious, but it seems like what they're probably trying to figure out is, what is your reaction to this news? Right? They're trying to gauge, like, how do you feel about the situation? Right? Like, dude, you're aware that, like, Elijah's about to leave. Right? Like, what do we do with this information? Right? Like, why are you not freaking out? Like, why are you not begging him to stay? Ultimately, this is another place, like, I'm just going to tell you straight up, there's a lot of stuff in this chapter I do not have the answers. I'm just going to raise the questions and kind of give my thoughts. I'm not going to act like I dogmatically know the answers, because ultimately I don't know if we need to, right? I think if the answer was supposed to be very clear, the author would just spell it out for us. But it seems to me that they're just trying to figure out, like, hey, how are you feeling about this whole situation, right? We have received this news from God that Elijah's about to leave. Have you heard this? Okay, so, like, why aren't you freaking out? Why aren't you, like, begging him to stay? We need Elijah here. Or are you fine with him leaving? Like what's going on? And then Elisha responds, and what does he say?
I know. So basically he says,
yes, I know, be silent. It's almost like he's just saying, guys, just wait and see. Right? He doesn't say that he's, like, feeling great about it or anything. He simply says, wait and be silent. This actually brings to mind another moment from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 14. If you recall, the people of Israel, they just left Egypt. The Passover just happened. And they ultimately arrive at the Red Sea, right? Where God guides them to the Red Sea, and things seem absolutely impossible because the Egyptian army comes after them, has them surrounded on all sides. There's a sea on one side, an army behind them. What are they going to do? They turn to Moses, and I'm trying to figure out... this is great. Verse 11. Then they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What is this that you have done against us and bring us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than for us to die in the wilderness." Right? So they're just, like, yelling at Moses, didn't we tell you that we shouldn't have left? If we had just stayed silent, we could have been fine. We were okay being slaves. And this is how Moses responds. But Moses said to the people, "Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever." And this is the part that this reminds me of. "Yahweh will fight for you, and you will keep silent." Right? So Moses, he just, like, turns to them and says, "Guys, stop yapping, shut up, and watch." Right? He's like, "Guys, you don't need to understand what's happening. All you have to do is sit back and let God figure things out." And then we know how the story ends. Right? The sea parts, they exit without raising a sword. They defeat the Egyptians because God himself does it. Right? God will fight for you. You only need to be silent. It seems like that's kind of what Elisha's communicating here too. They're like, "Dude, did you not hear what's going to happen to your master today? Why are you not freaking out?" And he says, "Guys, I know. I'm aware. This is not news to me. Be silent. Let's wait and see what's going to happen." Right? If God is going to take Elijah, he probably has a good reason. We continue on. And Elisha said to him, Elisha, please stay here, for Yahweh has sent me to Jericho. But he said, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. So they came to Jericho. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho approached Elisha and said to him, do you know that Yahweh will take away your master from over you today? And he answered, yes, I know. Be silent. Then Elisha said to him, please stay here, for Yahweh has sent me to the Jordan. And he said, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. So the two of them went on. All right? So, what do y'all think here?
Kind of continues the whole theme of things coming in threes.
Yeah.
Like, that's very prevalent. It's just like the three commanders went up to Elijah to bring him down from the mountain. Elijah says to Elisha to stay 3 separate times, and 3 separate times Elisha says, I'm going to follow you for all eternity, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you can think about the other parallels with a similar disciple with Jesus, right? Peter denies Jesus 3 times, but then 3 times Jesus has to say, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? It's like I don't know, something about like throughout the Bible, 3 is always like that number to just like, it's like it proves something, right? Because it's kind of like, this is a meme it's not a meme, it was like a joke I was showing Brienne, where the person's like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times, shame on you again, because you're messing with like the guy went on to I think fool me 8 times or something like that. But the idea is that, if something happens once, well, you really can't assess whether or not, it's from God or something. If it happens twice, oh, that's a kind of strange coincidence. If it happens 3 times, all right, well, now there's a trend, right? And so that seems to kind of be the case a lot of the times in the Bible, right? So obviously calling down fire from heaven to consume people, that's obviously a sign from God from the beginning. But the reason why it happened 3 times is because it took 3 times for the last person to realize, oh, I need to respond differently, right? I need to respond with humility, not pride, because apparently responding with pride did not help. And then here, we just get to see how persistent Elisha is. Another thing, I'm just referencing all these passages that this reminds me of. But I think in Scripture, we actually have the antithesis of this in the story with Jesus. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. Then a scribe came and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And another of the disciples said to him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, Follow me, and allow the dead to bury their own dead. One of the other Gospels, it shares also a third occurrence where Jesus just says, Follow me, right? Like the time is now. And so it's the threefold repetition again of Jesus saying, Follow me, but those people all gave excuses. Yeah. Here, Elisha, he actually has an excuse, right? His master is telling him to stay. But what we see is that Elisha's devotion goes beyond that. And he says, no, I'm going with you to the end, right? And I just think that's pretty cool, right? Elisha just seems like a pretty cool dude. So Elisha said to him, Elisha, please stay here, for Yahweh has sent me to Jericho. Right? So they're just going on this this final tour, just like this little circuit where they went to Gilgal, they went to Bethel, they're going to Jericho. We don't read why God sent him to those places, but that is the interesting thing, right? Yahweh has sent me to Jericho. It's not just that Elijah wanted to go there. For some reason, God sent him to those cities. Which, that's why I'm going back to the whole Joshua thing, because it seems like the author is drawing attention to the fact that Elijah needs to go to those places. Whereas we don't read about anything else that happens in those spots, which would communicate why he's there. So it must be something about the city itself that communicates the message. Do you understand what I mean there? So that's why I'm kind of going back to that Joshua thing. It's almost like, since Elijah recognizes that the people have rejected him, I mean, literally the last story ended with, the son of Pharaoh, right? You got Ahab's son dying in his bed, and ultimately rejecting God. Ultimately, this is like Elijah's farewell party where he's saying, okay, if you have rejected your God, then your God will reject you. And so he's almost like on a farewell tour, and he's undoing the conquest, right? Joshua led them in. Elijah is leading them out, right? Farewell Gilgal, farewell Bethel, farewell Jericho. Let the walls go tumbling back up. He's like, if they want to live like the Canaanites, then Elijah is leaving them to live like the Canaanites, and his ministry to them is over. And that's, in many ways, that's once again very similar to Jesus, right? Jesus is rejected by the Jewish people, and so as judgment on that, he leaves, right? And he departs to go be with the Father, but he leaves behind his apostles to continue his ministry. And so he says, as Yahweh lives, as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. So they came to Jericho. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho approached Elisha and said to him, do you know that Yahweh will take away your master from over you today? Same exact message, just different group of people. And he answered the same thing. Yes, I know, be silent. Right? Yeah, I get it, guys. Shut up. Don't make a fuss about it. It seems like it's almost supposed to be like a private matter, right? Elijah doesn't want it to make it a huge fuss. Elisha himself says, yeah, guys, it's fine. It'll be okay. It'll all work out in the end. Then Elijah says to him a third time, please stay here, for Yahweh has sent me to the Jordan. Right? So now we are actively making our way back to the edge of the wilderness. Right? Because basically over there you get to the wilderness of Moab and stuff like that, and Ammon. So if they're leaving Jericho and they're heading to the Jordan, most likely what spot are they heading to? Like if they're leaving from Jericho to the Jordan River, probably what place do you think they're going to be crossing the Jordan River?
The same place where Moses did.
Yeah, probably the same exact place where Moses and the Israelites entered in, which is pretty cool. Whenever Ben and I went to Israel a year and a half ago, what's really cool is we actually went to the site which traditionally is the location for 3 important events in the Bible. Where the Israelites went into the Promised Land, where Elijah ascended to heaven, and thirdly, where Jesus was baptized. And that's because ultimately, whenever you read about where John the Baptist baptized, there's a few places he baptized people, but where Jesus was baptized seems to be roughly in that same exact area, which is kind of cool because there's all these implications about that. If you want to go see those implications, just go look at the vlogs that I made.
My cousin was actually baptized there.
Really?
So my family used to live in Jordan.
Yeah, so I actually got baptized in the Jordan River the first time I went to Israel, back in 7th grade. And it's really fun because our pastor's name is John at a Baptist church. And so I was baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. And I will never stop reminding people of that because it's just hilarious. Okay, so we don't have to spend as much time on these verses because it's a lot of the same stuff repeated. And we've got to move on if we want to get to the exciting stuff. So as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. So Elisha is saying, I'm not leaving. You need to get that drilled into your head. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying with you. Elisha doesn't fight back. So the 2 of them went on. Now 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood opposite them at a distance. So you see them drawing a crowd. But the 2 of them stood by the Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle and folded it together and struck the waters. And they were divided here and there, so that the 2 of them crossed over on dry ground. Hey, what does that sound like?
Pretty much exactly how the Israelites entered.
Yeah, it sounds exactly like how the Israelites entered in. Except here's the cool thing. This is where it starts getting neat. I love this. Right? So, whenever the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, how did I say, like what went first? What was it that caused the ground to dry up? The Ark of the Covenant. What does the Ark of the Covenant represent?
Presence of God.
The presence of God. Okay, so now what does the mantle of Elijah represent?
The presence of God.
Seemingly the presence of God. Right? Because, I mean, if you're just following the parallels here, that's pretty cool. Whenever we're talking about the mantle of Elijah, what is that?
Wasn't that like his cloak?
It's his cloak, yes. And based off of the last chapter, what do we know about this cloak most likely?
It's hairy.
It's probably made of some sort of hair, right? Because remember, he was described as a man of hair. and most likely it was not just describing his body. It could have been, but it was most likely describing his garments,
Like a
right?
cloak of camel hair.
Yeah. And so it seems like the mantle of Elijah is probably just this hairy cloak. So he's going to take it. And there's parallels even beyond this as well. I think it's so cool. Because there's, not only does this call back to the crossing of the Jordan River, but what does it also call back to?
Crossing of the Red Sea.
The crossing of the Red Sea. How did the waters of the Red Sea begin to part?
I think it was Moses lifting up his.
It was Moses' staff, right? And so if you're kind of just running with the imagery of it here, what we're going to see is that Elijah is going to take his mantle and basically fold it together, like roll it up, right? To make it like stiffer, and then he's going to strike it like you would with a staff. And so it's almost like the mantle of Elijah, his very cloak itself, is the new Moses' staff and the new Ark of the Covenant. Keep in mind, we also aren't going to hear about the Ark of the Covenant ever again in 2 Kings. Remember the last time we see the Ark of the Covenant was whenever it was put in the temple. But it's almost like the prophet himself is the walking presence of God. That's really cool, especially because of what it's anticipating. Whenever you have the spirit of Elijah coming upon Elisha, and the spirit of God resting upon his church, like just the implications of that are really cool. You can spend a lot of time talking on it, but for now, let's just walk through it. Okay. So the two of them are making their way to the Jordan River, right? They're going from Jericho. They're going to the Jordan River, and 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood opposite them at a distance. So the anticipation is building up. Right? So they're just watching from a distance. They want to see what's about to happen because it's apparently going to be a spectacle. All of them have heard the news. How do they learn this? We don't know. Somehow God communicated it to them. Right? All the prophets, they're aware Elijah is about to leave. Why is he about to leave? The Bible doesn't tell us. It could be judgment on the people of Israel. It could be a reward for Elisha's faith. Or it could just be to show that God is the most powerful person who can literally triumph over life and death. And that, most people die, but if God doesn't want you to die, he can just take you up to heaven. Right? And also it could be a judgment on Baal. Because Baal is the storm god and the god of the wind and stuff like that. And Elijah's going to be caught up in a whirlwind and taken up. And Elijah's been the one calling down all this fire, and now fire's going to take him up. So not only can Elijah bring heaven down to earth, but fire can bring Elijah from earth up to heaven. There's a lot of different reasons why this could be the case. Ultimately, the Bible doesn't give us one answer, but it could be a combination of all these. But everybody's excited. The two of them stood by the Jordan, right? So they're all watching Elijah and Elisha. And Elijah took his mantle and he folded it together, so he rolls it up, and he struck the waters. And they were divided here and there, so the two of them crossed over on dry ground. So Elijah and Elisha exit Israel and cross into the wilderness, right? They're doing really two things here. On one hand, they're metaphorically reenacting the Exodus, right? The staff has parted the Red Sea, and Elijah and his disciple are like Moses and the Israelites, leaving the new metaphorical Egypt, right? The place of the pagan gods who have been defeated, and they are exiting into the wilderness, right? Where they will go and meet with God. Right? And that's what the Israelites did, right? They left Egypt, they went into the wilderness, they met God at Mount Sinai when God descended in fire. But then they're also anticipating the exile that the Israelites are going to face later on, right? They're going to be judged for their sin, they're going to be taken out of the land and sent again into a wilderness wasteland, right? So kind of both of those are happening here. They're divided here and there, so the two of them cross over on dry ground. And it's actually kind of cool that all these prophets are watching it. Because that means that whatever happens right here is not only going to be a private moment between Elijah and God, but it's going to authenticate Elisha's ministry. To where ultimately what we're going to see is that Elijah is going to pass the torch to Elisha. And by the time this whole story is over, nobody's going to be able to doubt that Elisha is the new Elijah. Right? Because they're going to be like, oh no, like this, some pretty cool stuff just happened. It's kind of like, the Holy Spirit descending upon the church at Pentecost, and they're speaking in different languages. Everybody's like, this seems to be legit. Now it happened, when they crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken up from you." And Elisha said, "Please, let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." And he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, If you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so. As they were going along and talking, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and it separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. All right, what happens there?
So, essentially, Elijah asks Elisha one last question, basically being like, if I can do anything in my power for you, let me know. And Elisha asks for part of Elijah's spirit. And then
not just part of the double portion.
Yeah. Well, the
Double portion of the spirit.
We don't know how much that is.
Well,
You would assume
it's a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you would assume it's a lot. And he's basically like, okay, if I'm going to do this for you, you have to actually watch as I'm taken up to heaven, which I imagine would have been a hard thing for Elisha to witness.
Yeah. Well, and I think what he's also doing is he's communicating that it's not his job to decide who gets what position. He's just trusting it to God.
Yeah.
So, like, if God allows you to see this to happen, then yes. Like, I think that's kind of also what's going on. Sorry. What else were you going to say?
No, I think it's exactly that. I think it's basically like, if Yahweh wants this to happen, if he would allow you to see what happens to me, like more so than I think the 50 who were standing would have seen,
Yeah.
then it shall be done.
For sure. All right, let's break it down. Now it happened that when they crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." So this is where they kind of address the elephant in the room, right? So far, it seems like Elijah and Elisha haven't been talking about what's about to happen. Elisha's been talking to everybody else about it, just saying, "Hey guys, keep it down." Like, it's a sensitive subject. Elisha doesn't want to talk about it. But now Elijah says, "All right, here's the deal. We're over here. We both know what's happening. I'm about to leave. Ask something from me, and I'll give it to you." What does that kind of what does that kind of bring back to mind?
Solomon asked
Yeah, Solomon back in 1 Kings, right? Whenever God shows up in a dream and says, "Solomon, like, ask anything of me, and I'll give it to you." And Solomon says, "I want a hearing heart and a heart of wisdom to govern the people," right? And ultimately, God gives him that and so much more. Well, that's kind of a similar request here, right? Elijah just says, "What is one final thing I can do for you?" Right? Of anything you could ask for, what do you want? And Elisha says, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." I think this is something very easy to misunderstand. What is he ultimately asking?
He's asking God's presence or spirit within him.
He's asking to remain with Elijah, I think more so.
I think his spirit, like the kind of spirit he had, like Elijah had, is on him. The kind of person he was on him.
Yeah, so one thing is whenever you read this just through like a modern lens, it's very easy to read this and it's almost like Elisha saying, "I want to be twice as cool as you." Right? It's like I want to be able to do twice as many things as you did. Ultimately, that's not what Elisha is saying. The phrase "double portion," if you go back to like the Torah, and also just outside of even outside the Bible, just ancient Near Eastern like context, the phrase "double portion" is the thing that you would give to the firstborn, right? So whenever all the children would receive an inheritance, the firstborn and the heir would receive a double portion of the inheritance. So if you remember, like in Genesis, even though Joseph is not the firstborn, ultimately he receives a double portion, right? That's why Joseph has two tribes, right? He has Ephraim and Manasseh, right? Basically, Jacob ends up adopting two of Joseph's sons and says, "I'm going to give you a double portion." So the double portion is the inheritance reserved for the heir. So whenever Elisha says, "I want a double portion," he's not saying, "I want to be twice as cool as you." No, he's saying, "Let me be your successor," right? Let me be the new Elijah, right? In your like we need somebody like you. can I be that person? And that's a big thing to ask, and that's what Elijah himself is going to acknowledge in a second. But he's basically saying, if you're Moses, let me be Joshua, right? If you're Jesus, let me be the apostles, right? Like he's saying, pass the torch to me. Let me do for this nation what you once did. And keep in mind, he's not asking for like glory and stuff. Because if you know anything about Elijah's ministry, it's not like he was like living in luxury all the time, right? This was a dude who wore camel's hair and a leather belt and dwelt out in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. So it's not like I don't want you to think that Elisha is like asking this out of pride, right? He's saying this out of genuine longing to serve God. He says, if you're leaving, let me step up and do that as well. And this also brings to mind another story in the New Testament, which interestingly enough has to do with James and John, who we talked about last week. Remember James and John, they were the ones who they asked if they could call down fire from heaven to consume their enemies. And that called back to 2 Kings chapter 1 with Elijah. Well, we have another story that seems to call back to Elijah and Elisha. And that's this. In Mark chapter 10. Then James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus, saying to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. You can see right off the bat that they're probably not going about this with the right heart. It's very different for somebody to offer to do something for you. It's very different to ask. Hey, I'm going to ask something of you and I want you to do it. So you can tell James and John probably are not quite Elisha figures yet. And Jesus says to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant that we may sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your glory. So they're asking to also be elevated to his status, but they have in mind the glory, right? They're not asking it with the same spirit of Elisha, right? They're not asking it with the humility. They're asking it in pride, right? We want to be in your glory. The issue is they don't understand Jesus' glory, because Jesus, from his perspective, his glory is his suffering. And so Jesus says to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those to whom it has been prepared. So Jesus says, fine. You think you can handle what I'm going to go through? Then you will. You will suffer. And you will face hardship. But ultimately, I'm not the one who decides who's in charge of the kingdom. That's up to the Father. And that's very similar to how Elijah is going to respond here as well. Right? Elijah, he is going to say, you have asked a hard thing. Right? He's like, Elisha, you don't know what you're asking for, man. Right? Like being a prophet, being the lead of the prophet, it's not easy. Right? It's not like we're living in heaven where everybody worships God. No, we are living in an idolatrous pagan land where nobody loves God, and you're asking to be like the leader of the God movement. That's not easy. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, if you see me when I'm taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if not, it shall not be so. So he says, Elisha, I can't make that call, but ultimately, God will. Right? And so here's the sign. Right? If you see me taken up, then yes, you will be the new Elijah. If you don't, well, then that's God saying that it's not for you. But that'll basically be the sign. So he basically just entrusted to God. But going back to the you have asked a hard thing, I think this is just a place for some good practical application. This is what we have to realize is facing all of us when it comes to like ministry or just serving God. And this is something that one of my students that I've been spending some more time with lately, he's wanting to hopefully go into ministry in the future. And a lot of the times our reaction whenever somebody says they want to be a pastor or something, or go into ministry, we say, wow, that's amazing. I hope God blesses you so much. But more and more, whenever I've had students coming up to me, and I've had several students like this because as a Bible teacher, you have a lot of students who will say stuff like this. I've started saying stuff more like what Elijah's saying here. Where, like I had another student recently who he came up to me and he said, hey, like he's like a Hispanic guy, and he says he wants to like preach at like a Spanish church to like help communicate to people. And he came to me during my off period to talk about it. And I just told him, I was like, hey, that's great, but just like recognize like the weight of what you're doing, right? It's not an easy thing. Or I had another friend, like one of the guys on my cross country team. He asked me, he's like, hey, Mr. Tate, you think I should preach chapel this week? Or sometime this year? And I said, If you think that you have a message that you need to share, yes. If you simply feel the desire to stand on stage in front of your peers and show how godly you are, then no. Right? And the whole thing is I feel the need to emphasize that ministry is something that you have to take with a very heavy weight, right? It's not supposed to be easy, right? If you are going to be the person who is kind of mediating between God and man, and I'm not saying that in the sense of as a priest. We don't, obviously all of us can access God directly. I'm saying if you're going to be the person who stands on a stage and preaches or teaches or is sharing the word of God, you've got to realize that is a huge responsibility on your shoulders. That's why James says those who teach will be judged more strictly, right? To where the people who are in that role, it's even more so as a prophet, right? Because a prophet, there's a reason why the punishment for false prophecy was death. Because you are falsely bearing witness about God, right? But the thing is, I think as pastors, we should also be very careful. That's why I'm such a stickler about reading the Bible in its context and stuff like that. Because I don't want to mishandle the Word of God. And I would rather be too careful than just play it fast and loose and say, oh, God will be gracious. Because I do feel that responsibility, and I think we all should, right? And so if you ever, one of the biggest frustrations to me is whenever in our churches we see somebody who gets really passionate about the Word of God, and we say, oh man, you should become a pastor. Well, no. We need people who are passionate about the Word of God who are working in every profession. Mm-hmm. All because you're passionate about the Word of God does not mean that you all of a sudden have to go into full-time ministry. Go into full-time ministry if literally there's nothing, if there's anything else you can do, go and do it. But if that is the only thing that in your heart you can do, okay, well, then you probably have to go into ministry. For me, that's how it was, right? There's other things I wanted to do, but literally I could not justify doing anything else. But I wanted to do anything else, if that makes sense. But I don't know, I just love that phrase, you have asked a hard thing, right? That's Elijah's response. He doesn't say, wow, Elisha, what a noble request. He doesn't say, good job, old chap. He says, it's almost he's like a father figure to Elisha. And it's almost like Elisha just asked him for permission to go and suffer. And he says, why couldn't you have asked for $1 million? I would have preferred that. But he says, you've asked for a hard thing. And he's like, I ultimately can't tell you whether or not you're going to get that thing. But I will give you a sign. And I'll leave it up to God. And so in many ways, it's almost like Elijah himself doesn't have to know the answer. Right? Elijah, he's going to go into the presence of God, and only Elisha will know what the answer was. Because Elijah will be so busy being in the presence of God, he won't have to know whether Elisha's going to have to follow in his footsteps or not. But I don't know. I just like that phrase, you have asked a hard thing. Do you have anything you want to say about that? Because I kind of talked for a while there.
I just feel like you have to, when you say you want to go into ministry, you have to and that's why I'm so hesitant to go do it or go preach out, because I've done it before, going out and try to preach and minister to people, and ultimately I felt like I've kind of fallen short, maybe, and I just need to work on living a more godly lifestyle first before I can worry about ministering to people.
Okay, so let me clarify something real quick. All of us are called to 100% full-time ministry in the sense of we do have to be sharing the Word of God with everybody, right? I'm more talking about in a vocational sense of like that is your full-time job, okay. Right? Because the thing is, you're right, none of us are perfect, but we can't let our own ungodliness excuse us. Sometimes we'll just be lazy, and we'll say, oh, well, I'll start preaching the gospel once I'm godlier. Okay, but here's the deal. You're never going to be godly enough, right? Because we're always going to fall short. And so we should always be trying to reach people with the gospel. That's something we should all do collectively. I'm more speaking in the sense of somebody who is going to willfully step into a more authoritative role, right? Because obviously, in general, in your daily interactions, you're not speaking as an authority. You're speaking as one friend to another, as one broken human to another broken human. You're saying, hey, here's who God is. Here's what I believe. Take it or leave it. Hope if you can approach that with the right humility and stuff like that, hopefully people will be more gracious towards you and they'll understand that you're not perfect, right? Sometimes they won't. That's okay. It's not your job to control them. I'm more speaking in the sense of a vocational perspective, right? Like what Elisha is asking here, he's not simply saying, hey, I want to serve God like you did. Well, no, because obviously Elisha's going to serve God either way. He's saying, Elijah, let me do the same thing you did, right? You did these miracles. God was undeniably with you, right? Like, let me be the new you, right? To the current generation. Let me do that. So he's asking for a much bigger thing than that. So I'm saying, like, if somebody's like for us, obviously we would not have prophets in the same sense, but if you're wanting to go into full-time ministry of being like a pastor or even a missionary or something like that, right? We should all be pastoral in the sense that we care for people. We should all do mission work in the sense of everywhere we go, we should view it as a mission field. But if you're going into it full-time, you've got to recognize that with great power comes great responsibility. And if you are going to be handling the Word of God and people are going to trust you to handle it, that cannot be taken lightly. That's more what I'm kind of talking about there, if that kind of clarifies things a bit.
Yeah, that does.
Yeah.
That does kind of clarify things.
Yeah. All right, so, nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if not, it shall not be so. As they were going along and talking, behold. I love that behold. Right? We don't know the rest of the conversation, right? They're just walking, they're talking, and then the moment comes. Behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and it separated the two of them. It's like a military procession, right? A chariot comes down and carries him up to heaven, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. So what's the deal with that?
Can you just imagine just walking and then suddenly whoosh?
Whoosh. I honestly, this is something that is hard for me to imagine. Like what this even looked like. Why do you think it's a chariot of fire? Like, what's going on there?
Could be an analogy to how Elijah was always like bringing down fire from heaven.
Yeah, so there is definitely that connection, right? Elijah is always bringing down fire from heaven, and it's always communicated that the fire is coming from God. And so now that there's fire carrying Elijah to heaven, well, I mean, in general, if anybody gets carried to heaven, that's probably an act of God. But the fact that it's fire, like you do have that kind of like the nice like poetic parallel, right? Elijah's always the one bringing the fire down, and so it's fitting that the fire is the thing that brings him up. But also, what is fire typically associated with in the Bible? Like fire and wind together.
Fire and wind together. Presence of God?
Yeah, the presence of God, right? So if you think about the Israelites going through the wilderness, God guided them by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. See you, Ben. Have a good night. And whenever God descends on Mount Sinai, there's fire and smoke and great wind and rushing wind, right? And so that imagery is the same. And once again, I just think it's so cool. What's being communicated about Elijah here is that, first off, you've got the mantle of Elijah, right, which is his cloak, and his cloak itself was like the staff of God, by which the power of God was performed, right? But it's also like the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence came to dwell. And so if his mantle is like the Ark of the Covenant, well, it's almost like God's presence dwelled in him. And then now, quite fittingly, God's presence comes down to take the one in whom his presence dwelt up into his presence. Right? It's like there's just like a lot of really cool stuff here to where this is basically just God in one final big, huge moment affirming that he has been with Elijah this whole time. Right? I mean, it's hard to deny that whenever this man has already called down fire from heaven several times. But what better way to communicate this than by literally freeing this man from death itself, right? He literally says, I'm going to take this man, I'm going to spare him from death, and I'm going to bring him directly into my presence. Like, that communicates a whole lot about Elijah. It communicates a whole lot about who this God is, right? He's not just one of the pagan gods can't do that, right? They might have other supernatural powers, stuff like that, but they can't conquer death. But Elijah's just taken up in a whirlwind. God can just do that if he wants to. That's crazy, right? Like, there's so many different cool things here that you could probably linger on for a long time. But this is like the final big moment where we get to see that God is with Elijah, and he is authenticating that through this moment. Also, Elisha's going to see it, right? And because Elisha sees it, what does that mean?
It means he's granted the spirit of Elijah.
Yeah, he's going to be the new Elijah, right? He's going to be the one who goes out there. And fun fact, this is like, I mentioned the whole double portion thing earlier and how it doesn't really mean being twice as cool. But if you actually look, whenever you read 1st and 2nd Kings, Elijah performs 8 miracles. And guess how many Elisha performs?
16.
16. I don't know if that's just coincidence or what, but it is kind of cool. But another thing I want to highlight is that whenever, so after Judas Iscariot dies, and the apostles are trying to find a replacement for him, do you know what the requirements were whenever they were looking at their candidates? There were really 3 things. Well, really 2 things, but...
Repeat the question.
So whenever the apostles were trying to find a replacement for Judas Iscariot, what were the credentials or requirements for the candidates to become the new apostle?
They had to have been with Jesus throughout his whole 3 years of ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was one of them.
And they had to have seen the resurrected Jesus.
Yes. So they had to have seen the resurrected Jesus, and they had to have been there for his entire ministry. But this is actually what's kind of cool about this, is that it specifically says, from his baptism by John, all the way to his ascension, which is his entire ministry, right? His ministry began at his baptism, and it ended with his ascension. But read that back into this, right? So they were trying to figure out who has the authority to be an apostle. And it goes back to baptism by John, ascension, eyewitness of the resurrection. Where was Jesus baptized?
The Jordan.
At the Jordan River. And then Jesus ascended into heaven, and Jesus conquered death. Right? Those are the 3 things that determine who can be the next apostle. Right here, Elisha, he sees all these three things happen at the same time. Right? You've got this guy who does not die, so he didn't resurrect, but he doesn't die. We see him ascend to heaven, and he's right by the Jordan River. Right? So literally all 3 of those things are here. And so it's almost like there is almost this Old Testament precedent for those exact requirements for apostleship. And I don't really know what to do with that information because I don't think that's what Peter and them had in mind whenever they saw that. I just think that's a cool, it's just a very, it's like one of those memes where it says if I had a nickel for every time this happened, I'd have 2 nickels, but it's strange that it happened twice. Right? That's kind of what's going on here. It's 2 instances where a person who doesn't, or who basically metaphorically conquers death, ascends to heaven, and is by the Jordan River. It's those are 3 very specific things, and both of them determine who is going to be the natural successor to the previous person. It's interesting. I don't know what to do with that information. I just thought I'd highlight it to y'all so that maybe y'all could reflect on it and figure it out for me. All right, we move on. And Elisha was seeing this. Hey, he saw it. And he was seeing this, and he was crying out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw Elijah no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes, and he tore them in 2 pieces. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and returned and stood by the bank of the Jordan. And he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and struck the waters, and said, where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah? Indeed, he himself also struck the waters. And they were divided here and there, and Elisha crossed over. All right. Let's break it down. So Elisha was seeing this, and he was crying out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. So, how does Elisha respond to this?
Crying out.
Yeah, but what's he crying out about? What does his emotional reaction seem to be?
I can't tell if it's joy or sorrow.
Yeah. I'm assuming it's probably sorrow, especially because he's going to rip his garments and stuff in a second. And he also probably seems to be a little bit freaked out. He's like, whoa, this is terrifying. But it also seems like, from Elisha's perspective, this is an act of warfare. Which I don't think it's an accident that, it's a chariot of fire and horses that come down and get Elijah. Right? It's not we know that God, if he wanted to, he could just whenever Jesus ascends, there's no chariot of fire, just as he was raised up into the clouds. Right? With Elijah here, for some reason, God chooses the act of war. And I think that kind of is communicating, once again, who Elisha is going to be. Right? Elisha is going to be the new Joshua. And when he enters back into the land, he is going on a conquest. Not a physical one, but a spiritual one, right? He is going in there to conquer the land for Yahweh once again, right? And so, whenever Elisha sees this, he responds in the same way the Israelites responded after they got through the Red Sea, right? Whenever they sang a song, if you remember Exodus 15, they sang, Yahweh is our God, there is no one like him, the horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. And they start praising God because ultimately the horses and chariots of Israel are not the human armies that fight for the king. The horses and chariots of Israel are God's heavenly armies, right? Because Israel, they're not like, if they lose a battle, that's because they're not trusting in God, right? Yahweh is their salvation. He is the one who fights for them, right? Remember, what does Elisha's name mean? God is salvation, right? Elisha, right? And so he looks at this and he gets the message, right? He says, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen, right? It seems like they all knew that a whirlwind was going to take up Elijah. He didn't know it was going to be chariots. And he looks and he's like, I get it. My father, I miss you. And this is to me, it's very similar to Joshua at the beginning, like whenever Moses dies. Right? Whenever you read the opening chapters of Joshua, do you know what phrase is repeated more than any other phrase? We love quoting it out of context or putting it on front of journals.
Be strong and courageous.
Be strong and courageous. Because Joshua is terrified. He spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness with Moses. He saw how stubborn these people are. And then he realizes that he is responsible for taking these band of slaves and turning them into an army that has to go conquer the Canaanites. And so God shows up to him several times saying, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. He's saying, trust me, I'll handle it. The first place they go, Jericho. And God says, you don't even have to raise a sword. Just march around the city, blow your horns, I'll send the walls come tumbling down. Right? So God communicates, I will fight the battle for you. That's the message that Elisha's getting here. Right? Elisha sees the chariots and he says, my father. Like he misses Elisha, but he also sees what's happening, right? Okay, I know what my task is going to be. And he saw Elijah no more. It's kind of sad. Then he took hold of his own clothes and he tore them in 2 pieces. Why did he do this?
So that he can.
Lamenting.
What's that?
It's like a sign of lamenting.
Yeah, he's lamenting, right? And because he doesn't need these clothes anymore, because he's going to throw on Elijah's. but the main thing is the lamenting. Right? He's grieving. That's a sign of grief, right? He misses Elijah, right? He's, yes, Elijah's in the presence of God, and that's great, but now the world has one less Elijah in it. And so he grieves. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him. So I guess Elijah went up naked. And he took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him. And that'd be kind of funny. Like, you just see him swooping up in the chariot, and then just the cloak comes fluttering down.
He pretty much went up shirtless because he took off his mantle and struck the.
Oh yeah, that's true. He also took up the mantle that fell from him, and he returned and stood by the bank of the Jordan. So he gets up and he immediately starts heading back to work. And it seems like he knows exactly what's going on here, because he takes the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and he struck the waters, and he said, "Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah?" Remind me, what does Elijah mean? Yahu. What is El? God. Yahu.
It's here.
Yahweh. Right? Eliyahu. Yahweh is my God. Right? So where is Yahweh, the God of Yahweh is my God? Right? So that's I was just trying to highlight the phrase there. So it's almost like this is a challenge, right? And keep in mind, there's people watching this, right? So I think this is in many ways a performance on the part of Elisha, right? He knows where God is at, because what does he have in his hands? The mantle of Elijah, which we've kind of talked about, is metaphorically representing the presence of God. And so you've got all these people who just saw Elijah ascend into heaven, and they associate Elijah with the presence of God, and now Elijah just went up in this fiery whirlwind, which in many ways looks like God departing. And if Elijah's departure was a judgment on the people of Israel, and if he is metaphorically going into exile and leaving in the wilderness, the message they could receive from this is that if Elijah is gone, Yahweh is gone too. Right? That could be the message they receive. And Elisha is going to correct that. he takes that mantle, he goes back, and just like Joshua, right? So Moses parted the Red Sea. What's the first thing Joshua does? Part the Jordan River, right? So here we have Moses departing, right? Elijah. And now Elisha, the new Moses, the new Joshua, he takes that mantle, he wraps it up, and he says, "Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah?" He strikes the water. And then what happens?
Parts again.
The water parts. So what does that communicate?
That is
Yeah. Where's Yahweh? He's with Elisha now. Right? So all because Elijah has departed does not mean that Yahweh has departed. Yes, Elijah's departure might have been an act of judgment on the people for rejecting God, but the cool thing is that God is faithful. Right? Just like Moses' death was judgment on Moses and the Israelites for rejecting God. But God still gave them Joshua, and he still gave them the promised land. Right? And so even though Elijah left, and in many ways his departure was a sad thing and a judgment on the people of Israel, now you've got this other prophet who's going to come in, and his ministry is going to be one that is more hopeful. So as we're going to see with Elisha, he's not going to be whacking his finger in the face of kings as much. His ministry is going to be one more like Jesus, where it's more like healing and miracles and performing some really cool stuff. Like he seems like a much happier person. You're not going to see that by the end of this chapter. Get ready for that. But he himself struck the waters, and they were divided here and there. And Elisha crossed over. So everybody sees this, and now everybody knows, without a doubt, Elisha, or God is with Elisha. Right? They know that. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho opposite him saw him and said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." And they came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. Then they said to him, "Behold now, there are with your servants 50 excellent men. Please let them go and search for your master, lest the spirit of Yahweh has taken him up and cast him on some mountain or into some valley." And he said, "You shall not send." But when they urged him until he was ashamed, he said, "Send." They sent therefore 50 men, and they searched 3 days but did not find him. So they returned to him while he was staying at Jericho, and he said to them, "Did I not say to you, do not go?" It's kind of weird. So what happens here?
It's like they're in, I guess, still in disbelief that all this happened.
Yeah, so I mean, like, they saw it happen, but they seem to be in, like, denial. Right? So the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho opposite him, they saw him, and they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." Right? They know this because, first off, they saw everything happen here. They saw the water part. Elisha is now wearing Elijah's garment. And they came to meet him. They bowed themselves to the ground before him. Right? They're like, "This is awesome." They said to him, "Behold now, there are with your servants 50 excellent men. Please let them go and search for your master, lest the spirit of Yahweh has taken him up and cast him on some mountain or into some valley." So what? To me, this is kind of silly. What do they think might have happened?
They thought that the spirit of God might have put him up on some mountain or valley.
Yeah.
Instead of like taking him up into heaven.
Yeah, it seems like they're thinking that maybe Elijah, like maybe that God had like second guessed or something. Like, I don't know. I can't follow the logic here. This is one of those places where I really don't understand what they're asking, because it seems like their mentality is like maybe God didn't act like. It seems like they're more in denial, right? It seems like they don't want to admit that Elijah is gone, and so they're like, well, maybe it's not that like he's in heaven. Maybe God just like picked him up and moved him somewhere else. But even how they word it makes it sound like that's not even what they think. It's almost like God swept him up and like then like he just like fell and died or something like that. Like it's hard to tell. Like, do they think Elijah is dead, or do they think like that he's alive and just like been like transported somewhere else? It's not very made clear, right? Let him go search for your master, lest the spirit of Yahweh has taken him up and cast him on some mountain. Right? So do they think that Yahweh might have like judged Elijah and said like, "Oh, you know what? I wanted you in heaven, but I second guessed that." I don't fully know why they're asking this. Other than the fact, like, I guess the only thing that makes sense is if you put yourself in their sandals, you'd probably be asking these questions too, because I don't care if you see a guy wrapped in fire and ascending up into the sky, even if he like departs into like in general, you're probably going to try to read a more naturalistic interpretation into this, because it's kind of a weird thing. and you're going to assume, I mean, what goes up has to come down, right? And so you're not just going to assume, oh yes, he was transported into another realm. You're going to be like, I don't know, maybe God like brought him up and then like put him down somewhere else, right? I mean, that's as best I can kind of guess here. I don't fully know. I'm assuming that they're just thinking like a normal human. Like if we were there, we'd probably be asking the same question. That's what I'm kind of getting across. Does that make sense? All right. So they're like, I don't know, like maybe God lifted him up and put him in like a mountain or a valley. Like, let's just go look around for him. And he said, you shall not sin. Why does it say that?
It's like, basically, you saw what happened. You're not going to find him.
Yeah, he's like, guys, like...
think for a second.
Yeah, you know that's not the case, right? It's like, guys, y'all know where he's at. He's not in a mountain, he's not in a valley, he's gone. I know that you don't want to admit it. I know that's not appealing to you, but that's just the cold hard facts. He's gone. You shall not sin. Don't waste your time. But when they urged him until he was ashamed, he said, sin. So, what does that mean?
They basically just kept pressuring him to allow them to search for him.
Yeah, they kept basically pressuring him to the point where he was almost embarrassed to not say sin, right? Like, the way that I imagine it is probably like they kept pushing it to the point where it's almost like it felt like he was like hiding something. You know what I mean? Like, they're like, dude, like I could just imagine like if you just like kind of flesh the conversation out to where they keep pushing him and they're like, dude, what are you trying to hide, right? If he's actually not there, then let us go find him. What are you trying to hide, Elisha? To where it's almost he's like, oh, I guess that's a fair point. Like, so like it's almost like he's ashamed. Like, sure, I guess like send him if you want. Does that make sense? Like it's got like I don't think he's ashamed in the sense of he's doubting what happened, right? I think he's ashamed in the sense of he's like, okay, like yeah, I mean this is not a hill to die on. I guess if you want to waste your time and go look for him, you can. I just don't see why you would. And so he's like, okay, send them. They sent therefore 50 men. I just think it's interesting. Like the last chapter, there's this emphasis on like 50 men. And like earlier we read that there's the 50 sons of the prophets, and then we have the 50 sons of the prophets here again. For some reason there's this emphasis on 50. I don't know what to do with that information other than like...
Maybe it's just the group of people that's been following Elijah and Elisha around.
Yeah, but I just think it's interesting because like, I guess you have all these groups of 50 that are being sent on futile errands. Right? Because in chapter 1, you have the groups that, like the 3 groups of 50 that are sent, and only one group of 50 is successful, and the other 2 groups of 50 are consumed by fire. Right? And so now you have another group of 50 who is like, let us go do this! And he's like, why? You're wasting your time. And I don't know, like, so you've got these people, like, I'm just trying to figure out, like, why it's emphasizing the number. Because it could easily just say, a group of men, but it doesn't. It says 50. You're like, so it seems like the author's trying to highlight that. So they sent therefore 50 men, and they searched 3 days, but did not find him. And there's the emphasis on the 3 again.
Yeah.
So they returned to him while he was staying at Jericho. I guess he was just like waiting around there, just being like, you know, just like twiddling his thumbs, waiting for them to get back. And he said to them, did I not say to you, do not go? So he's kind of being sassy here. He's like, I told you you were wasting your time. Like, you could have just, I mean, I could be 3 days down the road by now, but you just wasted my time and your time. So long story short, did they find Elijah? No. Right? They searched everywhere, far and wide, did not find him. And so basically everybody's like, oh, I guess Elijah is gone. And you're the new Elijah. So guess we should have listened to you to begin with. And he's like, really? You don't say? All right. Then the men of the city said to Elisha, behold now, the habitat of this city is pleasant, as my Lord sees, but the water is bad, and the land is unfruitful. And he said, bring me a new jar, and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. And he went out to the spring of water, and threw salt in it, and said, thus says Yahweh, I have purified these waters, there shall not be from there death or barrenness any longer. So the waters have been purified to this day, according to the word of Elisha, which he spoke. So what do we see happen there?
Is he pretty much just purifying the water of the Jordan River?
Not of the Jordan River, but I guess it's like a cistern in Jericho. So like the water in Jericho. Okay. There. Yeah, so it's kind of a weird first story there. this is really his first miraculous act, I guess, other than parting waters, which I guess is pretty miraculous and shouldn't be overlooked. What do you think the significance of this is?
Well, we could. I don't think it would be a direct correlation, but back in Exodus, when Moses turned the river, turned the river to blood.
Mm-hmm. What about it?
I'm just trying to draw random connections. This is me just speculating.
Okay. There was one thing I was wanting to find.
It could be something Jesus did, but I'm not drawing a connection.
Yep, there's one. I was trying to figure out. There's one verse in particular that I was wanting to look at. I was trying to find what the verse was.
What book is it located in?
In the book of Joshua. There's one verse that I found, but it wasn't the verse I was looking for. But basically, once again, what was the first city that the Israelites conquered? Jericho. Right? And so, if Elisha is the new Joshua, what's the first city he is metaphorically going to conquer? Jericho. Right? And so, quite fittingly, that's where he goes. Right? Also, if you remember, whenever they first conquered Jericho, they didn't do it, like what did they do first, before they actually conquered the land? Do you remember what they did?
They camped at Gilead and they had a festival.
Yeah, so they did camp at Gilgal.
Why do I keep calling it Gilead?
Yeah. So they went to Gilgal. Hold up. There was...
was Joshua like 6?
Yeah. All right. So I just want to highlight this too. Before they actually conquered Jericho, so we're going to go a little over tonight, just so you know, just because just because the parallels are just really cool. So before they actually conquered Jericho, they sent spies into the land to spy it out. And if you remember, the spies, they actually ended up staying at the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And if you recall, Rahab, she lived in like the wall of Jericho, so they were able to like sneak out the window and stuff like that. But whenever they were in the wall of Jericho, this is ultimately so after the spies left, this is what ultimately ended up happening. Verse 22. And they went and came to the hill country and remained there for 3 days until the pursuers returned. The pursuers had sought them all along the road, but had not found them. So the spies who went into Jericho, Rahab gets them to escape, and then she tells, like some people from Jericho, they say, hey, did you see those the spies? And Rahab says, oh yeah, they went that way. And she sends them on a futile errand to where the pursuers, they go look for how many days? 3 days, and they find nothing. Right? Very similar to what we see here. Right? To where Elisha kind of sends them on a futile errand for 3 days, and they find nothing. Right? And then, if you keep reading the book of Joshua, then the Israelites, they cross the Jordan, they surround Jericho, the walls come tumbling down. And then Joshua chapter 6:26. Then Joshua made them swear an oath at that time, saying, cursed before Yahweh is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn, he shall lay his foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son, he shall set up its gates. So Joshua places a curse on the city of Jericho itself and anybody who tries to rebuild it. And so, basically, he's saying this city is done. And I believe, I could be wrong, I'm pretty sure there's other verses in there where that curse is even strengthened, where it's saying that basically the whole place is just going to be contaminated going forward. And if you know anything about ancient customs, whenever you were wanting to destroy a city and keep it destroyed, do you know what they would typically do? What would they usually?
Basically, salt the fields. fields and they would make the water undrinkable.
Yeah, they would salt the fields and stuff, right? It's literally called salting the earth.
Yeah.
That's why, like, in The Chosen, they make a little joke about it, because, Jesus says that we should be the salt of the earth. And he, clarifies in The Chosen, I'm not talking about salting the earth. Those are two separate things. Salting the earth is whenever you conquer a city, and you basically sprinkle salt everywhere just to make sure that nothing can grow and that everything's contaminated.
Yeah.
Right? So that basically you can't, people can't rebuild. And so, that's kind of what Joshua instructed to be done to Jericho. Right? This city was supposed to become a byword. Historically, Jericho's pretty much always been occupied, but Joshua said that it's not going to go well for those people. And historically, that's been true, because basically it's been occupied by one person after another because it's constantly being destroyed. Keep that all in mind, right? So the Israelites, they send spies in, the spies escape, there's this 3-day fool's errand going to try to find the spies, they can't find them, and so now Elijah is almost in many ways the spies, right? He went to Jericho first, and then he left, and now he's gone. Right? Now Elisha, he returns to Jericho, and the men of the city said to Elisha, Behold now, the habitat of the city is pleasant, as my Lord sees, but the water is bad and the land is unfruitful. Well, that would make sense, right? That kind of ties back to what we saw back in the book of Joshua, right? It was supposed to be bad and unfruitful. That is the whole point, right? God wanted it to be bad and unfruitful to remind them of what happens when you oppose God. And this is where I think we get an idea of what Elisha's conquest is going to look like. His conquest is very different than Joshua's, right? Joshua's was a physical conquest where you were toppling nations. Elisha's is a spiritual conquest. He says, bring me a new jar and put salt in it. Now, is salt going to purify water? No, right? It's not going to do anything, right? It's like, if you put alcohol in water or something, it might purify it a little bit more, but no, salt's not going to do anything. But they bring it to him. This also calls to mind Jesus' first miracle, right? Whenever he says, bring me those jars and fill them with water, and he turns it into wine, right? Just keep in mind the parallels. So he said, bring me a new jar, put salt in it, so they brought it to him. And he went out to the spring of water and threw salt in it. And he said, Thus says Yahweh, I have purified these waters. There shall not be from there death or barrenness any longer. So now we have the conquest of Elisha is more of a conquest of redemption, right? What once was bad is now good, right? What once was dead is now alive. Very similar to Jesus and the apostles, right? Jesus, he conquers death, and therefore we go out preaching a message that death has been conquered. Elisha sees Elijah ascend to heaven and escape death, and now he goes into Jericho and says, death is no more. Right? He says, this place is clean going forward. That's kind of cool. Right? So we get to see this this little transition going on here. To where Elisha, his ministry, he's getting that, he's inherited Elijah's ministry, but his ministry is going to take a different, it's going to look a little bit different. Right? His ministry is more a ministry of grace. Right? He is going to be going about and he's going to be redeeming the land. Right? He is conquering it for God by almost planting little pockets of heaven everywhere he goes. Once again, like John the Baptist and Jesus. Right? John the Baptist wags his fingers in the face of leaders. Jesus goes around healing lepers and healing the blind. So the waters have been purified to this day according to the word of Elisha, which he spoke. When it says to this day, it's obviously talking about in the time period of 2 Kings. Even though, I will say, if you go to Jericho now, there is still purified water. But probably not necessarily connected to that. Even though if you go to Jericho, they do have a well, which they say is the well of Elisha. Is it actually? We have no idea. All right. Final verses. This is the best part. This is the controversial stuff. This is the thing that comes seemingly out of nowhere. Then he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, young boys came out and from the city, and they mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" Then he looked behind him and saw them, and he cursed them in the name of Yahweh. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. And he went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria.
Okay, then.
I like to cite this story a lot in my Bible classes because my high schoolers every single day do not fail to remind me that my hair is thinning and that I'm getting bald. And I remind them that there is at least one instance where young children mocked a man of God for being bald, and bears came forward and killed them. And I just say, hey guys, I'm not saying I'm going to call forward some she-bears on you, but it's not out of the realms of possibility. Obviously, that's a joke. There's a little bit more going on with this story than just that. But what do y'all think? What's going on here?
Oh, some boys came out and they're making fun of him because he's bald. And maybe they don't want him there because he's a man of God and they're maybe afraid of God, afraid of change, or don't believe in God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first off, where are these guys from?
Or maybe they're like pagan worshippers. We don't really know.
Yeah, so where are these guys from?
They came out from town, so he was on his way to Bethel.
Bethel.
So if Bethel is the stronghold of pagan worship per se, we can assume these boys are pagan worshippers to some extent.
Yeah, safe to say that these are probably not great guys. Also, one thing we need to clarify. The word for young boys there, let me look up what the actual word is. This word, it is the word na'ar, right? It can be translated boy, lad, servant, youth. It shows up 240 times in the Old Testament. But what you need to know is that this is a very broad term. I think it's Joseph. When he is 39 years old, he is described as a na'ar, right, a youth. Whenever Absalom rebels against King David, he is described as a na'ar, a youth. Keep in mind, this is a grown man who is described as a youth. I believe whenever Rehoboam goes and inquires of his friends, keep in mind Rehoboam is 40 years old whenever he becomes king, and it says that he goes and inquires of his friends that he grew up with. They are called na'ar. Those are 40-year-old men described as this. So I think it's safe to say that all because it's that word, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are like teenagers, right? Most likely what this is, it's describing their, it seems like this word is usually describing more their character than their actual age.
I was going to say maturity level.
Yeah, these people are probably just very, they're very immature, right? I don't want you to have the image of a bunch of 5-year-old kids who are showing up and just mocking a prophet. It's more like the image of a group of gangsters surrounding a man and trying to intimidate him, right? That's kind of what's happening here, right? It's not like an innocent oh, Baldy, get out of here. No, it's Elisha is surrounded by all these people who could easily let's break down how intimidating this situation is. So he went up from there to Bethel, right? So he is going into the devil's lair, right? The central place of paganism. And as he was going up, by the way, these people come out to him from the city and they mocked him. And they said to him, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." So what's up with this? So let's talk about the bald part first. What's going on there?
Are they just pointing out his physical appearance?
Possibly. Right? So that's why there's some ambiguity here. Right? They are calling him bald, but there is a way where this could be interpreted literally, and it could be interpreted metaphorically, but either way, I think the same thing's being communicated. Ultimately, it could be that they're literally just mocking him for his physical appearance, but if that's all they're doing, I would say that Elisha's response is a bit unjustified.
No, I think
there's something deeper to this. Yes.
They know he's a man of God, and they don't want him going near their place to worship, and they know if he goes there, he's going to bring opposition to what they believe.
Okay, so that's probably part of it. But, so, what does bald imply? This is not a trick question.
Nakedness?
No, kind of, but what is the opposite of bald?
Hairy?
Hairy. All right. Okay. Have we talked about hair anytime recently in 2 Kings?
The garments.
The garment of hair, right? Specifically associated with Elijah, right? And so it could be that they're noting his physical appearance and just noting that he does not look like Elijah, right? Elijah is a hairy dude, and this guy is not. Or it could be that they're speaking more metaphorically, and they're saying, where's your master? Right? Like, your master was a hairy man, and he ain't here anymore, you're bald, right? It could be that they're saying, like, you have no protection anymore, right? If Elijah's gone, who's going to protect you now, baldy? Right? Your hair's gone, right? Like, because remember, if you go back to chapter 1, he was described as a Baal of hair, right? A lord of hair, right? That is how Elijah was described. And so the lord of hair is gone, leaving his disciple metaphorically bald. Could this, once again, it could be just that they're describing this physically. I think either way, it's the same point being made, right? I think that you've got to read the baldness in contrast with Elijah's hairiness, right? So either Elisha is physically bald, and they're just addressing the fact that the physically hairy man is gone, leaving only a physically bald man. Or, metaphorically speaking, they're acknowledging the fact that Elijah has left and only Elisha remains. But either way, the same message is being communicated. And it could be both, right? It could be that they're using the physical description to communicate a metaphorical truth. Does that make sense? So I think that's the thing there. So they're addressing the whole fact that Elijah is gone, and they're probably pointing out the fact that Elisha presumably has nobody else to protect him anymore, because Elisha is just this nice guy. Elijah is always calling down fire from heaven. Well, who's going to cast down the fire now? And then what do they tell him to do?
Go up.
Go up. Go up. What do you think they probably have in mind?
Saying go away, because haven't we interpreted in the past like we go up in terms of like spirit?
So it could be going away, but keep in mind, what story did we just read?
They're wanting him to do what Elijah just did.
Kind of. I think they're referring to Elijah going up, but I think, given their mockery, I don't think they think that he can go do what he just did. But when Elijah went up, where did he go?
Heaven.
To heaven, right? Most of us do not arrive at heaven by being carried up in a chariot of fire. Typically, how do most of us go up?
Dying.
By dying. And so, whenever a group of 42 people surround you, and they say, go meet your maker, Baldy, that sounds a little bit like a threat, doesn't it? Right? So they're mocking him because his master is not here, but they're also saying, go up, go meet your master again, right? He's left you bald, you better go back and catch him, right? Go get your hair back. It seems like what they're basically saying is they're telling him to go die, right? Like, so that's why, like, whenever you read it just in English at first, like, if you're not noticing, like, if you're not reading the text carefully and, like, noticing, like, the hair stuff and everything, you read this and you're like, dang, Elisha must have been in a bad mood that day. What they're doing here is way more than simply, like, making fun of a bald man, right? They are mocking him. They're accusing him of, like, not being protected by God. They seem to be suggesting that he needs to either replicate Elijah's miracles or just go die, right? Like either way, like, they're trying to intimidate him. Like, that's what I'm saying. They're like gangsters, right? It's like he's being surrounded by all these people who are basically just, like, pushing him around, making fun of either his physical appearance or his, like, just, like, personal circumstances. And they're saying, one way or another, you need to go meet your master, right? Either have a chariot of fire come and pick you up, or we'll send you the easy way, right? So it seems like they're threatening him. Once you read that into this context, I think the rest of it makes a lot more sense. Because now you've got this one dude who has walked into the lion's den. He's surrounded by all these people. He's way outnumbered, right? 42-1. And they're trying to intimidate him. They're trying to mock him. And they're suggesting that God is not with him. And he says, oh, where is the God of Elijah? Oh, look, his mantle's on me. Then he looked behind him and saw them, and he cursed them in the name of Yahweh. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. And he went from there to Mount Carmel, and there he returned to Samaria. I think if you just stop and, like, break down that first part, the rest of it makes a lot more sense. So you're like, oh, so his life was probably actually in danger, and the glory of God and the reputation of God was in danger too. Because they're just over here mocking a prophet of God, and he says, oh, no. All because Elijah's gone doesn't mean that you can just start mocking God. My hair, like, I may be balding up here, but I've still got this hair on my chest. And so he calls out bears, and the bears kill him. Still, I mean, don't get me wrong. That doesn't make it less brutal. It's still brutal, but I think it's more reasonable, right? This isn't just like a guy getting offended because he was called bald. This is a prophet of God responding in a harsh but just manner towards his persecutors. Does that kind of make sense a little bit?
Yep.
Do y'all have anything y'all want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's about it for me. I mean, it makes sense.
I want to read this part real quick. The sons of the prophets inform Elisha that Yahweh will take your master from over your head today. Elijah, so going back earlier in the chapter, you know when it said, they will take your master from over your head today? Right? That's what the literal translation reads. I forget what it said in ours. It says, oh gosh. Oh my gosh. It said, do you know that Yahweh will take away your master from over you today? In Hebrew, it literally says from over your head today. Right? So even there, you've got the imagery of, Elijah is over his head, and by Elijah, the hairy man, being taken away, he is metaphorically leaving Elisha bald. I just want to highlight that. So Elijah is Elijah's protector, his guide, and his head, and Elisha is about to lose that leadership. As Elisha's head, as Elisha's head, Elijah enters heaven, while Elisha continues the work of his master in Israel, just as the church's head is enthroned victorious in heaven, as it suffers, serves, and overcomes on earth. Bethel is the site of Jeroboam, the first calf shrine, and the context suggests that these are not children, but Levites of the idolatrous shrine. Elisha's curse is an act of warfare, a Joshua-like attack on a center of idolatry. The young men mock Elijah because of his hairy head. His bale of hair is taken away from him. Perhaps he literally shaves his head in mourning over Elijah's departure, but it's also possible that they are mocking Elisha because they assume he is unprotected without Elijah. Their taunt to Elisha to ascend also points back to Elijah. You know where you could go, Elisha. Elisha again demonstrates that he bears the spirit of Yahweh, which is the spirit of Elijah, which is the spirit of Yahweh. For he can call out bears from the forest as readily as Elijah can call out fire from heaven to consume the soldiers of Ahaziah. And so I just wanted to highlight that. That's kind of what's going on with that story. And then at the very end there, he went from there to Mount Carmel. What story do we associate with Mount Carmel? There's one key story. It has to do with Elijah.
When the fire came down and consumed the thing on the top of the mountain?
The sacrifice. Yeah. Remember, this is where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal? It makes sense that this is where Elisha would go next, right? He's doing like a victory lap, right? So he just had a bunch of prophets of Baal, not prophets. He had a bunch of Baal worshippers killed in Bethel. And so he goes up to Mount Carmel, which is where Elijah had a bunch of prophets of Baal killed after victoriously demonstrating the power of Yahweh. Right? And then he returns to Samaria, Samaria being what?
The capital of Israel.
The capital, right? And so if he's going to be the new Elijah, he kind of needs to be near there. That's where it seems like Elijah was kind of headquartered quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so there is 2 Kings chapter 2. There's a lot more that we didn't talk about.
Kind of had to speed through the last half.
Yeah, because we spent a lot of time on it. Honestly, we could have easily split this up over 2 weeks, but I'm going to try to keep us on pace. And so expect there to be a lot of weeks like this, where we go really in depth into the first part, and then just like speed through the last. But next week is 2 Kings chapter 3, Israel warring against Moab. Do y'all have anything y'all want to add into our discussion tonight, or application points, or any final thoughts, comments, humorous anecdotes, trivia details?
Be careful by calling someone bald.
Yeah, don't do it, man. Might call out some bears on you. I want to see if there's anything else I wanted to share from this. I like quoting this commentary because it's got a lot of good stuff in it. The strategy of Elisha's conquest of the land is foreshadowed at the end of 2 Kings chapter 2. First, he heals the waters of Jericho, and then he curses the mocking boys of Bethel. Elisha's entire ministry follows the same order. First, he works to form communities of the sons of the prophets. He assists an indebted widow. He gives a child to the Shunammite woman and raises him from the dead, offers food to the sons of the prophets, tells the Aramean Naaman how to be cleansed, and recovers an axe head from the Jordan. Once the community of the faithful within Israel is flourishing, Elisha gives assistance to King Jehoram in battles with the Arameans. The double-sidedness of Elisha's ministry is critical. He does not minister to the prophetic communities in such a way as to neglect or forget all the concerns of Israel. Even while he mediates life to the prophetic communities and those associated with him, his work always manifests a deep concern for the entire people of God. He spends a long time in this commentary talking about like a lot of the Joshua and Elisha parallels, which I think are pretty cool. There's one more thing I want to highlight. Just because I actually thought this was pretty cool. The story of Elisha's departure into heaven follows the sequence of a sacrificial rite, such as in Leviticus chapter 1. By their mutual journey around the land, Elijah and Elisha form a unit, two of them. They cross the Jordan as parts of a sacrificial animal will be washed before being placed on the altar. Fire descends from heaven, dividing them in two, one ascending in fire to God as the altar portions of the animal ascend in smoke to heaven. In the ascension, or the holy burnt offering, the skin of the sacrificial animal is given to the priest, and the mantle skin of Elijah, the hairy garment or the bale of hair, is left for Elisha. Through this human sacrifice, Elisha becomes a successor to Elijah, and a new phase of prophetic history begins. In this sense, too, the story is a type of the sacrifice of Jesus, who is washed in the Jordan, gives himself over to be cut in two, ascends into a cloud, and leaves his spirit and his mantle with his disciples. I thought that was kind of cool. Like, just the imagery of a sacrifice, to me, actually helps make a lot of sense of that whole scene, right? If you just go read Leviticus 1 and you read about, how certain portions of the sacrifice would go up to God, and then certain would, be reserved for the priest and stuff, that makes sense. I'm like, it just explains why certain details are highlighted in the text. Some people might suggest that you're reading too much into it there, but for a Jewish person who was building their life on the Torah, and they read Leviticus a lot more than we do, right? And so I would suggest that it's probably not reading into it as much as it might sound like at first. All right, I just want to highlight that. Now I'm done talking. Anybody else want to add anything? Cool.
I'm fried.
I actually am too. I'm pretty tired. I've actually been fried for the last hour, if you haven't been able to tell. One of y'all want to close this out in prayer? Thank you, Maverick.
All right. Dear Yahweh, I pray to you that no matter what we went through today, that we went through your word that is written for anyone who wants to lean onto you, and that we not just take knowledge from tonight, but we apply certain elements in 2 Kings chapter 2 to apply it to our lives, and help us not to be a distraction, and help us just to lean on to you and not anything else of this world, Lord. And I thank you for everything, and I know I don't deserve even any of it, and I just want to say that you deserve all glory and all honor. It's in your name alone. Amen.
Amen.